I'm Kim McIntosh, and I teach biology at Shadow Mountain High School in Phoenix, Arizona. And this presentation is about cell transport. So we're going to be talking about how substances get across this cell membrane so that the cell can either get waste products out or bring in things that it needs. And as we saw before, this cell membrane is a little bit complicated, and it is kind of picky about what goes back and forth across it. So there are some different types of cell transport, and we're going to talk about those different types in detail. The first one is called passive transport, diffusion. Passive transport means that it doesn't require energy, so there is no energy spent by the cell for this process to occur. So in order for this to happen, what we see is that there are a high concentration of solutes, these would be the solutes, on one side of the cell membrane, and there's a very low concentration of solutes on the other side of the cell membrane. Now what happens is those solutes, they will move from the area of high concentration to the area of low concentration. And they keep moving until an equilibrium is reached. So when one side is equal to the other side, then they don't necessarily stop moving, but they'll just be some small movements back and forth, but it remains at equilibrium. Food coloring in water is a great example of diffusion. So we drop some food coloring into a glass of water, and you'll see that this is an area of high concentration, but these molecules will keep moving around until they fill this area of low concentration. All right, the next type of passive transport that we're going to talk about is facilitated diffusion. And we have the same situation here. We have an area of high concentration, so it has more solutes, and we have an area of low concentration, so it has less solutes. And what happens here is these solutes will basically bump into one of these proteins that's on the cell membrane, and it will be carried into the cell. So this doesn't require energy, it basically just allows it to move through this channel. The next one we're going to talk about is still a passive transport mechanism, but it's osmosis. And osmosis is the movement of water across that cell membrane. So it's still passive transport, it's still considered diffusion, but osmosis is directly related to water movement. So what we have here is on one side of the membrane we have a salt solution. So these red dots are considered the salts, and these black dots are considered water molecules. You'll notice over on this side there are no solutes, and on this side there are more solutes than there are water. So what will happen is the water will move to the side that has more solute concentration. So it has more salt, so the water is going to move this way. The reason the salt doesn't move is it gets blocked by this membrane. The barrier says, nope, can't go through there. And so the water can move, but the solute can't. So the water moves to this side until an equilibrium is reached. Now, with osmosis, we have something called tonicity. And this is how these different concentrations of solution will affect a cell. So I'm going to start with isotonic. It's the one in the middle. It's probably the easiest one to understand. It's when the solutes on the outside and the solutes on the inside are equal. Okay, so there's no difference in the concentration. All right, so you'll have some water movement in and out of the cell, but it basically stays fairly equal, and that means the cell is going to be normal. Okay. Now in a plant cell, it would be flaccid. So it would be what's considered flaccid, it would be kind of limp. So this is not such a good thing for a plant cell, but in an animal cell, it's what the cell likes. All right, a hypotonic Hypo means small or less. So what we have here is this solution outside has less concentration, and inside it's more concentrated. Okay, so because there's more of a concentration in the cell, the water's going to move in. And animal cells don't like this. They end up becoming too large, and see, this is showing that it's exploding, so that's called lysed. But the cell will actually explode because it has too much water in it. Now for a plant cell, this is normal. It's called turgid, and plant cells, this actually is good because they need to bring water in, and it helps them maintain the rigidness of the cell, and that helps the plant to remain upright. So that's a good thing for the plant, not necessarily a good thing for an animal cell. All right, the last one we're going to talk about is hypertonic, and hyper means large or too much. So think of that little brother or little sister you have that has too much energy. You might call them hyperactive. Well, in this case, we're talking about solutes. So we have more solute on the outside of the cell. We have less on the inside of the cell. So water moves out of the cell. And if that concentration on the outside is really high, then too much water is going to move out, and the cell's going to become shriveled and die. Think about if you put a freshwater fish into the ocean, then this is what would happen to their cells. All of the water would move out of their cells and they would die. For plant cells, the water is moving out. This kills the plant cell, so this is not good for the plant cell. All right, active transport is the next one that we're going to talk about. Active transport is really important to the cell. It does require energy, so that's why it's called active transport. So there is an energy requirement for this. But a good example of this is the sodium-potassium pump. And the reason that cells have to use active transport is because even if there is a concentration gradient, so even if there are quite a few of these sodium ions on one side, the cell still needs to move them to that direction of high concentration. Same with the potassium. There's quite a few potassium cells on this side, but it still needs to move more to that side. The reason a cell would do this is nerve cells do this quite a bit, because there needs to be enough of an energy gradient so that the muscle cell will actually fire. So what happens here is across the cell membrane, these sodium ions are moved, but it also requires an ATP molecule. So that's our energy for the cell. The ATP is used in this reaction to move those sodium ions across the cell membrane. Okay, so they go in here, the ATP has to be here. Once there's the ATP here, the energy from the ATP is used in the reaction, and then those ions are moved across. All right, there's another type of active transport. It's called endocytosis. Endocytosis is just a matter of the cell needs to get this molecule inside of it, but this is a large molecule, okay? So this is not necessarily going to just scoot across the cell membrane. It can't get across through diffusion, it's too large. It can't get across through the protein channels, and so what the cell is going to do is the cell is going to wrap around that molecule. So notice here, it's completely wrapped around it, and so it has basically just engulfed that molecule and brought it into the cell. And kind of the opposite of that is exocytosis. See, there's some molecules right here in a vesicle that need to be transported out of the cell. They're too large to go across the cell membrane, so this vesicle is going to move over here to the cell membrane. The cell membrane basically just opens up, makes a little gap here, and these molecules are released to the outside of the cell.